The meeting room on the Galactic Council ship was cold and quiet. Representatives from over 40 species sat around a long curved table, their eyes fixed on the star map glowing in the center of the room. One region on that map was marked in deep red. No label. No coordinates. Just a thick red border around a wide stretch of space that nobody ever talked about entering. Ambassador Vrethik, an elder from the Servani people, tapped the table with one of his long fingers. He had seen 7 full cycles of the Galactic Council. He had watched empires rise and fall. But that red region on the map still made his chest feel tight. The matter before us today, he said slowly, is the same matter it has always been. Human space remains uncrossed. Unmapped. Untouched. And we keep it that way. A younger voice cut through the silence. It came from a slim figure near the far end of the table. Serix, a junior diplomat from the Elhari people, leaned forward with wide eyes. He was young, far too young for most in that room, and he had a habit of asking questions that older diplomats had long ago stopped asking. But why? Serix said plainly. Humans have never fired on any of our ships. They have never sent fleets into our space. They have never threatened anyone outside their own borders. So why do we treat their region of space like it is filled with death? The room went very still. Vrethik looked at Serix for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. 200 years ago, the Drathiki Empire sent a scouting fleet into human space. 12 ships. Full crew. Fully armed. They crossed the border and they were never seen again. No wreckage. No emergency signals. No bodies. Just silence. Complete silence. And that silence has never been explained. Serix opened his mouth to respond, but another council member was already speaking, and then another, and the voices layered over each other until the whole room was buzzing with old fears dressed up as logic. Serix sat back in his seat and said nothing more. But his eyes did not leave the red section of the map. Far away, at the very edge of that same red region, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Captain Leon Hargrove stood on the bridge of the Border Patrol ship Ironclad Dawn, drinking cold coffee and staring at his sensor display. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the calm and slightly tired face of someone who had spent too many years on long patrols. His ship was not impressive by any military standard. It was functional. Reliable. Exactly what a border patrol vessel needed to be. "Sir," said Lieutenant Dana Cole from the seat beside him, "we are picking up a vessel. Alien design. Looks like it came in through Sector 9. It is not responding to hails." Leon set down his coffee. "Damage? Significant. Drive systems are barely running. Life support looks like it is holding, but only just." He looked at the display for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Take us alongside. Prepare a boarding team. Medical kit too." Dana glanced at him. "Rules of engagement, sir." "They are adrift, Dana. We help them." The Ironclad Dawn moved carefully toward the stricken vessel. When Leon's boarding team cut through the outer hatch and stepped inside, they were met by darkness and the sharp smell of smoke. Emergency lights flickered along the corridor walls. And then, from deeper inside the ship, came the sound of movement. Frightened movement. Leon held up one hand to stop the team. Then he stepped forward alone, slowly, with both hands open at his sides. Around a corner, pressed against the far wall of a small research bay, were 11 alien researchers. They were shaking. Their equipment was scattered across the floor. Some of them were injured. All of them were staring at Leon like he was the last thing they had ever expected to see, and like they were not sure whether they were glad about it. Leon looked at them for a moment. Then he crouched down so he was not towering over them and said quietly, "You crossed the border by accident. Your drive system failed. We are not going to hurt you. We have a doctor on board and we have food. Let us help you." Nobody moved for several seconds. Then one of the researchers, a small being with large pale eyes, stepped forward just slightly. Its hands were trembling. Leon smiled. It was a tired smile, but a real one. "Come on," he said. "Let us get you warm." An hour later, all 11 researchers were on board the ironclad Dawn. 2 had minor burns that Dana cleaned and bandaged. The rest were given food and warm water and a quiet corner of the ship to sit in. Leon sat with them for a while, not talking much, just being present so they could see he was not afraid of them and he did not want them to be afraid of him. One of the researchers, the small pale-eyed one who had stepped forward first, watched him with quiet intensity for a long time. Before they were escorted back to neutral space, that researcher slipped a small personal recorder out of its pocket and held it close. Its voice was barely a whisper. They were kind, it said into the recorder, in its own language, not sure if anyone would ever hear it. They were just, kind. I do not understand why the galaxy is afraid of them. Crossroads Neva was the kind of space station that nobody owned and everybody used. It sat at the edge of neutral territory, old and a little worn at the seams, with corridors that smelled like recycled air and cooking from a dozen different worlds. Ships from half the galaxy passed through it every week. Most people came to trade. Some came to talk. A few came to learn. Bryn Vosek came to learn that he was young for a Galactic Council diplomat, with bright eyes and the kind of restless energy that made older officials nervous. After the researcher's transmission had quietly circulated among a small group of council members, Bryn had filed a formal request to travel to neutral space and study humans up close. His request had been approved, reluctantly, with a long list of warnings attached. He had read the warnings. Then he had ignored them and boarded the next shuttle. Crossroads Neva had 3 humans on permanent staff. One of them was Dr. Naomi Pratt, a historian who had come to the station 15 years ago on a short posting and simply never left. She was a small woman with short gray-streaked hair and the kind of steady gaze that made people feel she had heard everything before and was still genuinely listening. She met Bryn in the station's lower library, a round room stuffed with data cores and old printed materials from 100 different civilizations. "You want to understand humans," she said, not as a question. "I want to understand why the galaxy is afraid of you," Bryn said honestly. Naomi smiled at that. It was not a proud smile. It was something quieter. "Sit down," she said. "It is a long story. And it starts a long time before any of the rumors you have heard." Over the next 2 days, Naomi walked Bryn through the early history of humanity. She did not soften it. She told him about the wars that had torn entire continents apart. She told him about the slow poisoning of their own planet, the collapse of ecosystems, the waves of illness and famine that had swept across their world in cycles. She told him about the moments, more than once, when it had genuinely seemed like humanity might not survive at all. Bryn listened in growing disbelief. "They did all of that to themselves." "Yes," Naomi said simply. "And they survived anyway." "Yes." Bryn sat back in his chair and stared at the table. "That is not comforting," he said finally. "No," Naomi agreed. "But it is important. Because the thing about humans is not that we are powerful. It is that we are very, very difficult to finish. Every time something tried to end us, including ourselves, we found a way through. And we came out the other side a little harder and a little more careful than we were before." On the 3rd day, Bryn asked about the Drathiki fleet. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into a data core and pulled up a set of old files. They were classified, but she had clearance, and she laid them out in front of Bryn without ceremony. "This is what actually happened," she said. "The truth was not what anyone had imagined. 200 years ago, when the 12 Drathiki ships crossed the border into human space, humanity had been in the middle of its own internal collapse. A series of failed treaties, resource crises, and regional conflicts had pushed Earth's political systems to the edge. The last thing anyone in human leadership wanted was a foreign military fleet wandering through their territory, but they did not destroy the Drathiki ships. They could not afford to. A war with an outside power, on top of everything else, would have been the end of them. Instead, a small group of human officers quietly intercepted the fleet, guided them through an unmapped gravitational corridor that most outside navigators did not know existed, and sent them back into Drathiki space through a region that was completely unmonitored. No shots fired. No contact logged. No record kept on either side. The Drathiki fleet returned home through a back route that their own people had never charted. The ships were listed as lost to unknown causes. Humanity never corrected that assumption, partly because they had no diplomatic channel open with the Drathiki at the time, and partly because the fear that followed served them well. While everyone else was whispering about the fleet that vanished, nobody was interfering in human space while humans were busy trying to hold their civilization together. Bryn stared at the files for a long time without speaking. From across the room, an old man's voice broke the quiet. The silence was never a weapon. Bryn turned. In the far corner of the library, almost hidden behind a stack of data cores, sat a very old human man nursing a cup of something warm. He had white hair and the slow, careful posture of someone whose body had decided to take things easy. His eyes, though, were sharp. "Admiral Owen Garrett," Naomi said by way of introduction. "Retired. He comes in here most mornings." Owen did not look up from his cup. "The silence was never a weapon," he said again. "It was a door we left closed because nobody knocked politely." He took a slow sip. "Funny thing about doors. People always assume the worst about what is behind them." Bryn looked at the old man for a long moment. Then he looked back at the files. That evening, alone in his small cabin on the station, he began writing a transmission back to the council. He kept it short and careful. He described what he had learned about the Drathiki incident. He described what Naomi had told him about human history. He concluded with a single question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since he arrived. If the terror of human space was never real, then what, exactly, was real? What was actually inside that red region on the map? He sent the transmission. Then he sat in the dark for a while, thinking about doors. For the first time in recorded galactic history, an alien delegation crossed the border into human space and was not turned back. That it had taken 6 months of negotiation to arrange. The council had debated it endlessly. There were protests from 3 member species who felt it was reckless. There were counter-arguments from 2 more who felt it was overdue. In the end, a small group of 5 delegates was approved, with strict conditions and a human escort assigned personally by Earth's Border Command. Sarix was one of the 5. He stood at the observation window of the delegation ship as it crossed the boundary marker, and he held his breath without meaning to. He was not sure what he expected. Something dramatic, maybe. A shift in the color of space. A feeling of pressure. Some sign that they had entered a place that was genuinely different. What he got instead was ordinary. Mining platforms drifted slowly through the system ahead, their long arms extended into the rock of nearby asteroids. Cargo haulers moved between them in slow, patient lines. On an open broadcast frequency, a cheerful voice was reading out children's educational content, something about the history of ocean life on Earth, clearly meant for a school program somewhere in the system. The voice was warm and unhurried. Sarix stared at it all. "This is it," he said quietly. "What were you expecting?" said a voice beside him. He turned. His human escort had come to stand at the window next to him. His name was Caleb Dune, and he was the kind of person who seemed to fit wherever he was placed. He was not tall, not particularly impressive looking, with dark eyes and a calm manner that made Sarix feel oddly at ease. He was the chief engineer of Station Oral, a civilian science platform a few hours further in system, and he had been assigned to the delegation because he was, according to the official file, good with people. Sarix did not have a ready answer to the question. He looked back out the window. "Something more frightening," he admitted. Caleb nodded slowly, like that was a reasonable thing to say. "People usually do." Station Oral was busy and a little noisy and smelled of machine oil and coffee. The humans there barely looked up when the delegation arrived. A few nodded politely. One woman offered Sarix a plate of something baked and sweet, which he declined, then accepted, then found he genuinely liked. It was all very normal, and that normalcy was somehow more disorienting than anything dramatic could have been. Then the delegation sensors picked up something. It appeared on the display as a cluster of enormous shapes drifting near a cold, dim star at the far edge of the system. The shapes were massive, unlike anything the delegation had seen before. They were partly mechanical, partly something else, something that read as almost biological on the sensor returns. They had no weapon signatures. They had no drive activity. They just floated there, silent and vast. Two of the delegates grabbed their seats. One reached for a communication device. "What are those?" one of them said, voice tight. Caleb glanced at the display. He looked briefly surprised that anyone was alarmed, and then he let out a short, quiet laugh. Not mocking. Just the laugh of someone who had completely forgotten that a thing he saw every day might look terrifying to fresh eyes. "Those are the Arcs," he said. That he explained it plainly as the delegation ship moved slowly toward them. The Arcs were generational ships, built during one of humanity's refugee crises a century and a half ago. When the crisis passed and the ships were no longer needed for their original purpose, humans had repurposed them. Each one now contained a self-sustaining ecosystem. Not one ecosystem. Dozens of them, layered inside each other, separated by sealed biomes with controlled environments. Dr. Petra Voss met them at the airlock of the nearest Arc. She was the station's senior xenobiologist, a tall woman with quick hands and the habit of talking faster when she was excited, which appeared to be most of the time. She led the delegation inside. What they found there stopped all five of them completely. There were forests. Real forests, with canopies so high they disappeared into artificial mist. There were shallow seas with creatures moving in them, creatures that no longer existed on any living planet. There was birdsong from species whose homeworlds had been dead for 80 years. There were insects smaller than a thumbnail pollinating flowers that had not existed in the wild since before the delegation's grandparents were born. Serix walked through it slowly, turning around more than once, trying to take all of it in. "You have been keeping these," he said. It was not quite a question. "For 112 years, Petra said. Some of these species we managed to save from extinction. Some we preserved from worlds that were destroyed before they could be helped. We have records and living samples from over 300 ecosystems that no longer have a planet to call home." Serix thought about what everyone in the galaxy had assumed was in human space. Weapons. Fleets. Some terrible secret force. While they had imagined all of that, humans had been quietly filling their space with forests. That he was still thinking about that when another delegate tugged at his sleeve and pointed at something on a handheld sensor screen. A vast and silent network of arrays blanketed the entire region, hundreds of thousands of small nodes spread across the system in a pattern that clearly had a purpose, all linked together, all feeding into something that was not labeled on any chart. Serix looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the display. Then he looked at Serix. There was a pause that lasted just slightly too long. "Environmental monitoring," Caleb said. He said it evenly. He said it without looking away. But Serix had spent his career watching people give careful answers to questions they did not want to fully answer. He did not push. Not yet. But he filed the moment away, the slight pause, the chosen words, the way Caleb had not quite smiled. That night, alone in his quarters on Station Oral, Serix listened to the distant sound of the arcs and wrote one line in his personal log. "They are not hiding weapons. But they are hiding something." It took Serix 3 weeks to get a formal answer. He filed the diplomatic request the morning after his visit to the Arcs. He worded it carefully, respectfully, as a genuine inquiry rather than a demand. He asked about the sensor network. He asked what it connected to. He asked what it was monitoring. The response from human authorities was polite and brief. The matter was under review. They would be in touch. They were in touch 22 days later, in the form of a quiet message from a woman named Director Lena Ford, head of a deep-orbit installation above Earth called the Cradle. The message said only that she was willing to have a conversation and that Captain Leon Hargrove had been assigned to escort Serix personally. Leon arrived at Station Oral 2 days after that. He looked exactly as Serix had imagined him based on the accounts from the border incident at the start of all this, steady, unhurried, with a soldier's way of standing that managed to look relaxed without being careless. He greeted Serix with a handshake and offered him coffee before they departed, which Serix was beginning to understand was something humans did whenever they wanted to signal that things were calm. The journey to the Cradle took half a day. As the installation came into view, Serix pressed his face to the window without meaning to. It was enormous. A deep-orbit structure set high above the blue curve of Earth, shaped like a long spine with dozens of branching arrays reaching outward in all directions. It did not look military. It looked, if anything, like a scientific instrument. A very large, very old, and very purposeful scientific instrument. Director Lena Ford met them at the main docking bay. She was a middle-aged woman with short hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular kind of calm that belonged to people who spent their lives managing very large problems. She shook Serex's hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Thank you for being patient." She led them through the cradle's upper levels and into a wide observation room that faced the sensor array feeds on one wall and open space on the other. She sat down across from Serex and folded her hands on the table. "You want to know what the network does," she said. "Yes," said Serex. She nodded once. Then she started talking. The sensor network had begun as a military defense grid, she explained. It was built during humanity's worst period of internal conflict, meant to detect incoming threats from any direction. That conflict ended. The grid remained. And as the decades passed, the humans who maintained it began noticing things that had nothing to do with rival nations or rogue ships. They noticed cosmic things, rogue bodies drifting through the dark at speeds that made standard navigation hazardous. Stellar events building toward chain reactions that could destabilize nearby systems. Pathogen signatures riding cometary debris toward populated worlds. Gravitational anomalies forming in ways that natural drift could not account for. The galaxy, it turned out, was full of quiet dangers that nobody was watching for, because every civilization was too busy watching each other. Humanity started watching instead. Lena pulled up a set of records on the wall display and walked Serex through them one by one. Over the past century, the Cradle's network had identified and logged over 400 events that posed genuine risk to inhabited systems somewhere in the galaxy. Of those, 260 had been neutralized or redirected through human intervention. A rogue neutron star, nudged off course by a grid of deep space drone arrays over 11 years of slow, patient pushing. A comet carrying a biological signature that matched no known pathogen, destroyed by a targeting system that had never been publicly acknowledged. A destabilizing binary star, held intolerable balance long enough through targeted energy pulses for the 3 inhabited worlds in its orbit to complete an emergency evacuation. Serex stared at the records for a long time. "None of these were ever announced," he said. "No," Lena said. "Why not?" Leon answered that one. He had been quiet through most of the briefing, sitting slightly to the side, but he spoke now in the same even tone he used for everything. "Because if we announced it, every species in the galaxy would immediately want to know how we built it, how it works, and how to make sure we could never use it against them. We would have had a dozen civilizations building counter-systems and pointing weapons at us within a generation. A war nobody could win, started by fear of a thing we built to protect everyone." "So you stayed quiet," Serex said. "We stayed quiet," Lena confirmed. There was a long silence in the room. Outside the window, the slow curve of the Earth turned under the light of its sun. Serex looked at it for a while. He thought about all the things the galaxy had assumed about what lay inside human space. He thought about the old admiral on Crossroads Neva, drinking his morning coffee and talking about doors. Then he asked the question that had been building since Lena first started talking. He asked it quietly, because he already suspected the answer would be heavy. "What has the network found that you have not been able to stop?" Lena and Leon looked at each other. It was a short look. A brief exchange. But Serex had spent years learning to read the moments between people's words, and what he saw in that look was not fear exactly. It was something more serious than fear. It was the expression of 2 people who had been carrying a very large weight for a very long time and were finally, carefully, considering whether it was time to set it down. Lena reached for a sealed file on the table. She entered a code. The file opened. "Sit down," she said, though Serex was already sitting. "This is going to take a while." The emergency session of the Galactic Council was not quiet. It had barely been quiet for a single moment since Serex stood up and began to speak. He spoke for almost 2 hours. He laid out everything: the Drathiki fleet, the true history of human space, the arcs, the 100 years of silent intervention, the sensor network, and the sealed file that Lena Ford had opened for him 3 weeks ago in a room above the Earth. He spoke calmly and without drama, because he felt the facts needed no embellishment. They were more than enough on their own. When he finished, the room came apart. 4 species spoke at once, their translators overlapping each other into noise. 2 more demanded that the session be suspended while their governments were consulted. Ambassador Vrethek, older than anyone else in the room and usually the steadiest voice at the table, sat with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and said nothing for a long time, which was somehow more alarming than all the raised voices combined. Someone near the back called it deception. Someone else called it manipulation. A third voice, from a species that had always been diplomatically careful, called it exactly what it was, a century of protection that everyone in the room had benefited from without knowing it. Through all of it, Director Lena Ford sat quietly at the delegation table, waiting. When the noise finally began to thin, she asked for the floor. She was given it, reluctantly, by a chair who looked like he was not sure he had any choice in the matter. Lena stood up. She did not have notes. She did not have a prepared speech. She just looked around the room, taking her time, and when she spoke her voice was level and clear. She told the council what the sealed file contained. She did not soften it and she did not dramatize it. Somewhere at the far edge of the galactic core, moving slowly but steadily in the direction of the inner systems, there was a gravitational anomaly unlike anything in the scientific record of any civilization. It was not a black hole. It was not a rogue star. It was something the Cradle's best analysts had spent 6 years studying without being able to fully classify. What they could classify was its direction and its speed. Their models gave it 60 years before it began disrupting inhabited systems. Their models also said that no single civilization had the resources or the reach to address it alone. The room went very still. Lena let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said the thing she had come to say. We are not asking for control. We are not asking for command. We are asking for cooperation. Every piece of data the Cradle has gathered, every model, every resource we have, we are offering freely and openly to any civilization that wants to work on this together. We kept the network quiet because we were afraid of what fear would do. We should have trusted you sooner. That was our mistake. But there is no time left to be careful about it now. She sat down. The room was quiet for a long time after that. People looked at each other. Translators murmured. Somewhere near the back, a junior delegate was hurriedly writing something down. Ambassador Vrethek, who had not moved or spoken since Sarix finished his account, finally lifted his eyes from the table. He looked at Lena. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was hard to read, part anger, part something that might have been a very old embarrassment, part something else entirely. He had spent decades telling younger diplomats that human space was a place of hidden terror. He had repeated it at tables exactly like this one. He had believed it so thoroughly that he had never once thought to look for another explanation. That he cleared his throat. The council, he said, slowly, accepts the offer. Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of moment. But the tension in the room shifted, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long finally being set down. 3 months later, the first joint fleet assembled at the border of human space. Ships from 11 civilizations lined up in a long formation, some of them flying alongside each other for the first time in history, some of them keeping a careful distance that would probably narrow over time. At the head of the formation was Leon Hargrove's ship, the ironclad Dawn, looking exactly as functional and unremarkable as it always had. Leon stood on the bridge in his usual posture, hands loose, coffee in hand, looking out at a fleet unlike anything that had ever existed before. Dana Cole stood beside him. Ready when you are, sir. Tell them to take us out, Leon said quietly. The fleet moved. Back at Station Oral, Caleb Dune watched it go on his monitor. The formation was small against the scale of the display, a handful of lights against the wide dark, but it was moving together in the same direction, which was the thing that mattered. That he picked up his communicator and sent a short message to Dr. Petrovas, who was somewhere in the Arcs running her usual morning checks on the forest biomes. Doors finally open, he wrote. Her reply came back in under a minute. About time. The galaxy had spent 200 years afraid of the silence of human space. It had filled that silence with stories of vanished fleets and hidden power and terrible things waiting in the dark. It had built walls out of that fear and called them wisdom, but the silence had never been a threat. It had been a choice made by a species that was too busy surviving to explain itself, and too tired of being misunderstood to try. Behind the silence were forests full of creatures with no other home. Behind it were 100 years of quiet hands redirecting things that could have killed millions. Behind it were people like Leon and Lena and Caleb and Naomi, ordinary and steady and difficult to finish, and now the door was open, the small lights moved together through the dark, heading for something enormous and unknown, and for the first time in a very long time, they were not going alone.